Open the public hearing of the Standing Committee on Education's inquiry into the factors driving educational attainment. I acknowledge the traditional custodians, the land from which we all meet today, and pay respect to the elders past and present of the Indigenous peoples across Australia. This hearing will be broadcast and the transcript of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. Before we begin, I'd just like to invite members of the committee to introduce themselves. We might start from my far right and move across.
No worries. Zee Soon, the member for Banks in southwestern Sydney.
Hi. Hi Fiona, Joanne Ryan, member for Lawler, out of west of Melbourne.
Tim Watts, the committee chair from Western Melbourne.
Sam Birrell, member for Nichols, deputy chair of this committee, also shadow minister for regional education, shadow assistant minister for regional education.
Lou O'Brien, federal member for Wide Bay.
Thank you very much.
Well, I now welcome the Regional Education Commissioner to give evidence. For the benefit of Hansard, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
The Honourable Fiona Nash, Regional Education Commissioner.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and it has the same standing as proceedings of the House. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I just want to acknowledge that Ms Cheney has also joined the hearing.
My apologies for being late.
Sorry, I wasn't trying to call you out. Ms Nash, would you like to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion?
No, I don't have an opening statement, but I would just like to acknowledge and thank the committee for their interest in the particular regional aspects around educational attainment. With 30-odd% of the population living outside of our cities, the perspective of this committee on regional issues relating to educational attainment will be very much welcomed.
Well, thank you. Well, as a committee member who was educated in regional Australia, I have a keen interest in this hearing, and I know that there are a number of other members with plenty of questions. So I'll lead off with a few questions before passing over to my Deputy Chair. Now, Ms Nash, your submission draws on ACARA data to demonstrate a clear attainment gap between regional and urban students in Australia. With only 55% of remote and very remote students attaining Year 12 certification compared to nearly 80% of students in major cities. Your submission summarises the issue as one of access, saying, quote, any approach to equitable education in the regions must account for the reality of geographic isolation, significant distance to services, decreased population density and the associated increased costs mean that access to education is more difficult in the regions than in metropolitan areas. You suggest that improving access to high-quality distance education and forming school clusters that share resources, and your annual report goes into further detail to say that school clusters are needed for greater access to subjects, allied health services, transport networks, regional study hubs, career advice as examples. Can you explain to the committee how high-quality distance education can bridge accessibility gaps for rural and remote schooling? And can you provide examples of effective models of distance education delivered by state or territory governments that support this or could be implemented nationally? And does the school cluster model that you talk about need to be delivered in a different way or expanded to further regional schools?
Thanks very much, Chair. And probably two separate things I'll deal with there, obviously the distance and then the cluster issue. The distance delivery of education is incredibly important, and you all know I'll be stating the obvious that where you don't have a school nearby, where a student can't easily access a school, and where students are living in more regional, rural or remote areas that aren't moving out of those communities, and neither they should have to, then what is the best way to make sure we get really good education provided for those students? So one of the options is distance delivery, and the better experience a student can have through distance delivery, obviously the better off their learning is going to be. There still are some challenges with it. Certainly when I look at some secondary school students that I've spoken to, often it's only one student in a class. They might be delivering just to one particular student. So being able to do that without very much support from school staff who are often just completely stretched in so many other areas. It's no indictment on the staff whatsoever, but it just becomes really challenging. So the better that distance education is delivered, the better experience the student is going to get. SIDE in WA do that very well. The department, clearly WA, massive state, as you would know, that it really caters for a lot of distance delivery. So I've had some discussions with the department over there about their particular approach. They might be certainly one entity you might like to follow up with. There is also great delivery through Aurora. They also do a really good job in delivery, but there are a number now of the entities that are doing this really, really well. I think it's a case of looking at not a one-size-fits-all, and certainly people out in regional areas don't expect to have everything on their corner when they know they're living in a rural and regional or remote place. They expect a reasonable level of equity in the services that they require out in those regions. You know, I often say people out in the regions don't expect a heart surgeon on every corner, but they do expect access to a really good GP service wherever they are. So I think that's really important to keep in mind with distance. And again, really taking into account for the students the challenges of not having face-to-face. I've literally just come from a meeting with James Cook University, which I might get to later, and we were talking about the absolute benefit of being able to have a face-to-face experience as a student. And so obviously that's not just university, applies to schools as well. With the cluster models, this is really interesting. A few years ago, as Regional Education Commissioner, I became aware of a cluster program in South Australia at Streaky Bay, and the principal at the time, Chris Roberts, had put together a cluster of schools that were able to collectively utilise the experience of the teachers in the region. And it's been incredibly successful over time. I think from memory, they have about 5 or 6 schools in the cluster. It's a very rural area, some significant distances between the schools compared to metros. But what they were able to do was have the expertise of a teacher in a particular subject, say, for example, physics, that would teach into students across all of those schools. And the teacher would actually spend some time rotating, so the students would all get some access to a face-to-face teacher, but they were able to access the subjects that they needed, particularly when there were students that were going on to a particular course at university that might have had a particular subject as a prerequisite. I remember the story of a young lady there who I spoke to subsequently after she'd finished at the school, and she did all of her schooling right up to year 12 in that school, utilised the cluster model to do her subjects and went on to do medicine. So I think from that regional perspective, when there aren't the economies of scale, having schools being able to work together to get that economy of scale to be able to deliver really well for students, I think is a really important thing, and something more schools should be looking at potentially doing. That's one of the things that often comes up in my role as Regional Education Commissioner as well. How do we not reinvent the wheel, and how do we look at cases of best practice and spread those across to other areas across the country?
Thank you. One of the things that I found particularly interesting about your submission was that you sort of spotlight the importance of high-quality careers advice to students in regional areas. And I call this out really as access to that high-quality career advice is really a luck of the draw issue for regional kids. And we know that the impact that having a clear objective can have on kids' attainment, having a goal to strive to focus on knowing why the work matters. And your submission says that this high quality advice is quite critical to help regional students understand their options for future pathways and to nurture their aspirations. You propose a national assessment to investigate this issue and develop baseline standards in career advice. Can you let the community know how that would work, and how do you see that careers advice would successfully introduce more learning and workforce opportunities for students?
Thanks, Chair. But I don't think there's a more important issue for students and making sure that we unlock the potential of every student across the country, really then access to good careers advice. That doesn't always just come from schools. It often comes from other older people in the community. It might come through people they're involved with in a sporting organisation. It might be friends. It might be community organisations. But predominantly, we see it through schools. Somebody come up with a great phrase, whoever it was, I think was just tremendous, and that's, you can't be what you can't see. And for a lot of young people in regional areas, when we compare them to metropolitan areas, they literally don't have the exposure to all of the pathways and opportunities that might be there for them to consider when going on to a future career. And when I say pathways, I mean both vet and higher education pathways. They're both parallel pathways to success, in my view. But the delivery of that careers advice and again, it's not being critical, because there are an awful lot of pressures on our teachers in schools as it is, and a lot of the career advice role does often fall to a teacher. Some have specific careers advisors, others it might fall to teachers as part of their role. So I absolutely accept there's a lot of challenges there. But anecdotally, it's very hit and miss. You can get very good careers options for students. You could get very limited careers advice options for students. And that's really having a significant impact on that student being able to make a really well-considered, thoughtful decision about the future path that they want to take. So having got a lot of this anecdotally over years, it became very apparent that there's not a lot of data that goes with that. I've got a sense of it because I'm the Regional Education Commissioner. I travel around a lot and I talk to a lot of people in the sector and in communities, even more importantly. And the data and evidence just isn't there to be able to substantiate where it's working well, where it's not. And we don't even really have a basic minimum delivery requirement of what we would like to see in careers advice, which is why I said there should be a national assessment of careers advice across the country to get a picture of the current state of careers advice, what needs to be done, where it's working well, where it's not. And then decision makers, potentially state and territory ministers, it's usually a state and territory delivery careers advice, but across the nation, it's an important thing. So how they can collectively think about, on good advice, what's going to be best practice for the delivery of that careers advice. That luck of the draw comment actually came last year from a young woman, amazing young woman. She was Australia's youth ambassador to the United Nations. And she'd been doing a regional tour and talking to regional people across a lot of communities. And I didn't raise it, she did in the conversations that we'd had. And she said to me, Fiona, it's just luck of the draw whether or not students in regional areas get good careers advice. So vitally important that we, A, get a better understanding based on data and evidence around current practices in careers advice, and then how we can do it better. During COVID, the then Careers Institute set up a phone option to deliver careers advice to students. That's since ceased. I understand it was pretty well patronised during the period of time, and it might be something the committee might like to have a look at. When we're looking at different ways that careers advice might be delivered, I think we need for regional areas to really look across the board and make sure that young folk have access to as much as they need. The other thing to mention as well, careers advice is not only, when we're talking about educational attainment, that goes through, lifelong learning, and really important as well for people who might be mid-career changes or middle of their, life's journey, decide to embark on a certain area. Where do they get their careers advice? They're not in the school, they don't have that opportunity, but really important as well when we're seeing often that change in careers for people who might have already had one or two, or indeed mid-career might be the first after a range of circumstances, that they need that advice as well to be able to get on that pathway.
Thank you. Well, Ms Chaney is under time constraints, so I'll give the call to her next.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just further on that careers advice, and you recommend a national assessment. Who do you think is best placed to do that national assessment? Would it be Aero, ACARA or your office?
Certainly wouldn't be my office. I have a very tiny secretariat staff of people who punch well above their weight. Look, I don't think I have the expertise to actually definitively say who would best be to do it. Certainly either of those, I think, should be very well considered. But there might be another opportunity, another entity that might want to do it. It might be something that the department might want to take the lead in and have some competitive process for a tender for somebody to be able to provide it to the government. I think it's a whole range of issues, but I would sort of backtrack to one step and find the decision maker who would like to say, yes, we need to get this done. So I think that's step one. Maybe that's a question for the Minister for Education, I don't know. But certainly that, and then determining who would be best placed to do it. I think it's incredibly important that that work is done.
Thank you. What recommendations from the 23 VET review for regional and remote have been implemented, and what have been the barriers to adoption or implementation of those recommendations?
Sorry, which VET review are you referring to?
VET delivered to secondary students, RRR provision.
The actual specific number of recommendations I'm not sure of, so I'll just speak generally in terms of VET in schools. One of the things that we have seen really over very recent times is the really quite significant increase in VET in schools. And what we're finding is that many of those students who are seeing a pathway early are really appreciating the opportunity to be able to start doing that VET engagement actually in school and not move off to that further learning once they've finished. It's increasing across the board. Certainly it's increasing in the discussions I've had through the state schools, but I was interested as well. I met with the Independent Schools Regional Committee in New South Wales not long ago. They were even saying across each of their schools they had seen an increase. So I really think it comes back to providing students choice for what they see as their future pathway and being able to enable them to get on that pathway as early as possible. It really gives them a heads up start. We know as well in regional areas the workforce shortages in a whole range of areas that rely on VET qualifications. I think we're seeing that in a number of students who can see future workforce opportunities out in the regions going through that VET in school option. So something I think that needs to be really well considered in the future of how we're delivering education, particularly to young people in the regions. And again, I come back to the options. Some students want to go through to the end of year 12 and do a pathway, an ATAR pathway into universities. And that's absolutely fantastic. Others don't. It's how we best provide for them in the best capacity as they're going through their school years to be able to, at that point of completion of year 12, be on the pathway that they want to be to their future work arrangements.
Thank you. So just to be clear, you're not aware of those 2023 recommendations or whether they were useful. I guess if we're churning out more recommendations, it's good to know what the previous ones have said and where the challenges have been. So maybe that's something you could take on notice and just have a look at those recommendations and see where the implementation barriers are.
Very happy to. I should have indicated that at the outset. Thanks, Ms. Chaney.
Great, thank you. And just one more quick one, if I may, Chair. Your data shows the gender gap in Year 12 completion roughly doubles once you're in a remote setting, and also that we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. Do you have any recommendations that are specific to very remote rather than just regional cohorts? Are there things that you think we need to be doing specifically in relation to that gender gap in very remote settings?
That is such a good question, and it really raises the difference at the outset of the difference between regional and rural and remote and very remote, because they are all very, very different. In terms of that gap, I think what we're seeing in a lot of areas when boys are not completing Year 12, that it could be for a whole range of issues, and one of them I think is also the pull from workforce. So in some of our more remote areas where we've got mining and significant workforce opportunities for young people, I think young males will be more inclined to take up those opportunities. In terms of improving that, I think it partially comes back to careers advice. When we can show young men a future pathway and have them make a decision early on about the pathway they would like to take, that can be very, I guess, encouraging in terms of getting them through to complete to Year 12 and to make sure that they've got, all of the education that they need to take that next step. So that careers advice again, and providing the opportunity back to young people very early on in their learning pathway, I think, and again, particularly as we're talking about young males and the discrepancy there, can be very, very important in terms of getting them on a pathway and keeping them there. I go back to you can't be what you can't see. And for young men in particular, it can be really challenging. I also think role models, having good role models for young men, and I mean this relates to everywhere, but I think particularly in remote areas where there are a lot more challenges. I would say that I think there's a role for communities to play in supporting our young people as they're going through the education pathway. We see a lot of both young men and young women, of course, but in terms of the numbers and the lower numbers for boys attaining Year 12 in remote and very remote, being able to have the benefit of sporting associations and getting that support and I guess the guidance from people around them in making sure that they know the benefit of potentially having that Year 12 attainment and getting on a pathway to their future career.
Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Ms Nash. Following on from what Ms Chaney was saying, this inquiry is about us looking at factors affecting attainment, and I think we're still coming to terms with what those factors are. Regional, rural and remote are obviously factors. The data shows that. It appears gender seems to be factors too, and I think we would like to drill more into that. Just on that, so obviously, as has been said, the ACARA data that you talk about shows that the difference between boys and girls in terms of major cities and very remote is quite different in terms of Year 12 certification rates. Just can you comment on that a bit more, but also the fact that Year 12 certification rates is not, when talking about regional people, is not also, or remote people, is not also, necessarily the definitive data about educational attainment either, because some people move into apprenticeships and that sort of thing. So could you talk about that? And really, do we have enough data to understand what is happening in relation to differences between gender, attainment relating to gender, and how we can improve that?
Look, again, a very good question. And one of the things as well around Year 12 certification is often, as you all would know, in our regional communities, we only have central schools that go to Year 10. So even the availability of having a school with a Year 12 option can become problematic for a lot of communities. I put that data in there because I felt that it was really quite startling to look at the difference between the certification rates from the major cities boys at 76% and then remote and very remote boys 49%. I thought was absolutely startling. But then what really concerned me as well was the comparator between the boys and girls in the remote and very remote, the boys at 49% and the girls at 62%. So then having a look at this, which goes directly to your data question, we really struggled to find more data around the comparator between metro and regional across education issues, but then broken down into boys and girls, broken down into that gender. I think for the committee, given that there seems to be very little data out there on that basis, I think it would be a great thing for the committee to pick this up and do that detailed work around making sure that we've got a really good picture into that, what the reasons are for that discrepancy. There might be positive reasons, as you were saying, Mr. Burrell, around, sorry, I should say Deputy Chair, positive reasons around if a young fellow has left school before the end of Year 12 to go off into do an apprenticeship, a trade or whatever. There are often very good reasons for it, but I don't think we understand it nearly well enough. And we do need to be able to look at the differences in those gender outcomes across those particular areas.
Thank you very much. Part of what we are going to do as a committee is as you say, try and find out where there is a lack of data and information, and hopefully maybe recommend that we try and find that out. But also, we want to look at best practice in terms of attainment. So, is there anywhere that stands out for you as best practice in regional, rural, and remote? And as you explained, they're very different. In terms of where there are good results, positive results around gender, but also around other factors affecting people's educational attainment.
Thanks, Deputy Chair. If you'd be happy to, I'd really like to take that on notice. Please. To give you some good detail. Yep. I'd be very, very happy to do that. One thing that you might want to look at as well from the tertiary perspective is talking to some of the universities around not only just the education attainment, but then also this issue of male and female attainment. And in terms of education attainment more broadly, I know that James Cook University is doing some great work and has some tremendous statistics from that Queensland perspective. So I think it would be well worth talking to JCU. They were saying to me, it was literally just earlier this morning, there's about a 50% gap in the NAPLAN results between major cities and their remote areas in Queensland. That's significant. But when we look at challenges, it's great to look at solutions, and they have some tremendous work at foot to improve what they call the capacity in students to be able to learn and to be able to go on and to be able to complete. So I think that would be a very worthwhile discussion if the committee was minded to talk to them.
Okay, if you could take that on notice, because I think you'd be in a position, given your role and your experience, to point us in the direction of where we could see best practice, and maybe that's something we can do as a committee. Look at that best practice and then see if that can't be rolled out at other parts. Yeah. Just one more thing, a couple of things. Just VET in regional Australia, vocational education and training. I mean, I think, I don't know, if you may have seen vocational education, given your career, you may have seen vocational education around the world, particularly in how it works in Europe and Canada. And you might be able to point us in the direction of how it works there, both in cities but in regional parts of Europe, because they do have regional parts, and how it works in Australia.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chair. The first part, I would be happy to take on notice for you, but you'd probably have a better understanding. My role as regional and my former role as Member of Parliament and now has been very domestically focused. Okay. So I can certainly assist in that matter, but in the offshore arrangements, there would be others rather than me who would have a good idea on the information you would need there. All right, just further to that then, in your experience of what you've seen in regional education, is the VET sector meeting the demands of regional industries in your broader experience? By and large, what I'm hearing, yes, it is, but it can vary. So some industries will be very positive about the nature of students that are coming through the VET education delivery. Others will be looking for more qualities that may not have been delivered as well as they might have liked. So there is a bit of variation. There are a number of things in VET, though, for regional students that are quite challenging. And as you know, Deputy Chair, one is the distance, literally, to be able to access VET education. And that is becoming more and more problematic. And we're having young people who are having to travel great distances to access vocational education and training. There are then obviously housing and accommodation issues when they're getting to areas. You would understand this very well. So that adds a challenge for a regional student that a metropolitan student simply doesn't have. I know in the VET sector itself, it's obviously quite challenging in a lot of areas to get the educators that they need in the VET sector. They, as you would know, require a qualification compared to university, which don't. And I know that Minister Clare is very focused on quality teaching, which in the new Australian Tertiary Education Commission, there's a significant focus on making sure that quality teaching is delivered and doing some work on that. Interestingly, TAFE does by and large, really good job in many areas. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough, in my view, are the private RTOs out in the sector. A significant number of regional students access their vocational education and training through a private provider, others through TAFE, but very much both are important for delivery in the regions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr O'Brien.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm putting my hat on as envoy for men and boys, and I've got a real interest in terms of this gap in literacy between boys and girls, which we've heard has been a reasonably long-standing or a consistent gap for some time. Are there any programs or what, if this has been the case for a long time, what has been done to remedy it from where you sit? What have you observed?
Look, I'm very happy to take that on notice, because as a specific response to a challenge, particular programs on that haven't been raised with me. But I'm very happy to take that on notice and come back to you. The point you make is a very good one. And if this has been happening for a long time and we've seen these outcomes for a long time, what's not working well in what's being used to try to address the challenge? So that's probably something for the committee to really grapple with through this process that you're doing. And again, I take my hat off to you looking at this very important issue around educational attainment. I'm a great believer in not doing things the same and expecting a different outcome. So if it needs to be much more closely considered, it might need a particular lead. There might be a particular decision maker in government that might need to lead a bit more strongly on this to really have a look at what is going to move the dial and change some of those numbers.
Thanks. Do you have any data on teacher, gender of teacher ratios in the regions compared to the metros?
No, I don't have any data. Again, I'm happy to take that on notice. My office and my secretariat are not set up to do specific data provision on a whole range of areas. I'd love them to be. So happy to do that. But anecdotally, I can certainly tell you that the number of male teachers, particularly in primary education, is starkly different to the number of female teachers in primary education. It's raised with me often, both from within schools, from headmasters and in communities, the observation of how few male teachers there are in primary schools. Now, that's only anecdotally, and it's from various places as I travel around, so it's certainly not data or evidence. But I think it's pretty stark when you actually go into these communities and see the teachers in the schools to look at that gender disparity.
Oh, that's all for me. Thanks, Fiona.
Yeah, just one follow-up on that. We heard, to follow up from Mr O'Brien, we heard 70% across the board, roughly, I think, from the last hearing. But I anecdotally, that could be higher in regional areas. Do you think that feeds into a you can't be what you can't see, and that things could be improved if there was a focus on trying to have more males in the teaching profession?
I can certainly answer that from my perspective, not a data perspective, but I think absolutely. We talk a lot about young men needing role models, and teachers are very, very good role models for young people. So in my mind, it just stands to reason that if you have got a young male student who is in need of a male role model, and they're either not in that school or not available or not many of them, it just common sense would say to me the ability to have that role model support for that young male in that school just simply isn't there. And I think we can all go back to thinking about when we've been young at school and how important we've thought various teachers are. I think doubly important for young men. And we're living in a world that has a lot of challenges. There's a lot of unsettling things happening around the world. There's a lot of communities that are challenged. And I think we don't take into account enough the impact that can have on young people and how much support that they actually need.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I should just warn members and witnesses that we're expecting divisions in the coming minutes. So if that happens, I'll have to bring the hearing to a close. But before that, I just wanted to jump on, well, two things actually. Listening to the conversation here and the advice of teachers and guidance, career counselling here, I was reflecting on that teacher who tapped a young Weary Dunlop on the shoulder in regional Victoria and said, here's a pathway available to you to get a scholarship to continue your studies to become a doctor, setting him on a path to becoming one of Australia's greatest Australians, a pathway that he was not considering before that intervention. So it just demonstrates just how vital that conversation is. But also listening to Ms Nash talk about, I think, the very important role of mature age education in rural and regional and remote Australia. Federation University's submission flagged that post-secondary education in the regions is disproportionately a mature age undertaking, as many adults from rural, remote areas return to study as a means to reskill or as local job markets change. Do you want to share the implications of that with the committee and how we should think about that lifelong learning challenge or lifelong learning opportunity in rural and regional Australia and how we can better support that?
Thanks very much, Chair. And can I just pick up, as you said at the beginning, the idea of a student getting a scholarship and opening up a future for them. And I should have raised this earlier. The barrier of cost for regional students compared to city students is exponentially different. And whether it's families having to travel to get their young children into early childhood education and care, if they have access to it, whether it's travelling to school, whether it's having to get on a bus that takes an hour and a half to get to school compared to cities when it's just down the road, when it's having to relocate altogether to go on to tertiary education, that cost barrier is really, really significant in terms of not only enabling young people to complete their level of education that they're at, particularly talking about school and tertiary in that circumstance, but also to remove the barrier of them even going in the first place. And that particularly, I think, applies to tertiary attendance at tertiary institutions, again, vet or higher ed. So that issue of cost as a barrier, I think, is one for the committee to really deeply reflect upon and how that might be ameliorated in some ways for students with things like scholarships and those sorts of things. One thing I will mention there that the committee might also like to have a look at are the current arrangements for independent youth allowance support for regional students who, as you would know, are required to do a period of time to prove their independence. To my mind, those students are independent the minute they have no choice but to leave their home to go away to tertiary education. So that might be something that the committee might like to consider during your work. In terms of the lifelong learning, and I had the very enormous privilege of being on the Accord panel a couple of years ago, doing all of the work around now getting to the Accord recommendations, many of them being implemented. But one of the things we were very focused on, Chair, is exactly what you said, and it's lifelong learning. And how do we support people to be able to access learning and education no matter where they are on the pathway? A number of the universities have a significant cohort of those mature age learners, and do a tremendous job when we've got mature age workers. And I think one of the things for the committee to consider there is the balance and blend that a mature age person often has in juggling work and study. It might take them a lot longer to complete their qualification, but the benefit and what they gain at the end of that, and having a qualification, and having been to a number of graduations, seeing mature age learners graduate, it's inspiring stuff. It really is. I shouldn't say stuff. It's really inspiring moment. So for them to be able to access that learning at any point along the life pathway is really important. We've seen the regional university study hubs grow over time. They are also providing great opportunity in the regions for all students, not just mature students, but for all students. And I do want to commend Minister Clare for expanding those regional university study hubs, because they're incredibly successful. The people attending those study hubs would not have left that community and gone somewhere else to get the support and often access study if that hub hadn't been there. Quite often it's really assisted with completion. And we're talking about educational attainment. The chances of those students completing their study when they've got the support from a regional study hub compared to just individually doing online learning is significantly greater. And I think really having a mindset across the country that mature age learning is a good thing to do, that if you want to learn, if you want to change career, or if you want to learn for a variety of reasons, that the education sector will be able to support them. And I think that's really important.
Let's give the call to Ms. Coffey.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everything that you've shared. I'm conscious there are going to be bells any moment, so this may end up being a question on notice. I'm interested in your perspective when it comes to servicing students from those regional, remote and very remote communities where there's not necessarily I'm not near a microphone, that may not be helping, where there's not necessarily educational options. Traditionally, and I know you address boarding schools, traditionally boarding schools have been in capital cities and regional kind of centres. I'm just interested if you've got any perspectives on boarding school options, for First Nations students on country, for example. I know Yothu has a partnership up in northeast Arnhem Land with the Barker School. But even not necessarily First Nations students, even having something like Farrer Agricultural College in Tamworth, having those options that are boarding programs but closer to home, whether you've got any perspective on how successful they are and if they're a model that works.
I believe, again, no data to show you, but anecdotally very successful. I've literally just been in the last few weeks talking to the Isolated Children's Parents Association, who have a proposal for a model for this in Queensland, which is absolutely terrific. So having an agricultural boarding school, they're looking, I think, at southwest Queensland to do that, and it's a significant proposal, not just for them, but the principle in general, to be able to bring education to the regions and provide it in the regions for those students, I think is incredibly important. We certainly know at a tertiary perspective, but I think from a school perspective, it applies as well. If you study in the region, you're far more likely to stay in the region. And when we've got significant workforce shortages out in regional areas, to be able to build that pipeline through with things such as you're suggesting, and having those boarding schools actually in regional areas, I think is tremendously important.
Apologies, we just snuck it in under the bell.
I don't mean to disparage those programs that do, where children do travel, because I think there's absolutely a place for them, but just curious on your views. So thank you for that.
Very much so. And I will just take on notice as well, I do have some information regarding some suggestions for First Nations education actually
Fantastic.
on country. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
We won't get back from these bells to continue this hearing, unfortunately. So thank you for your evidence today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence. We'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. You'll be advised by the Secretariat of the due date for questions on notice. Thank you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you very much.
Apologies for the abrupt conclusion.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Chair.